It's my pleasure to have this opportunity to record this session for you. I want to share some ideas about networked learning and my favorite topic, higher education transformation. And as I said, I've titled this session, Networked Learning and Work, Dissolving the False Dichotomy in Support of Lifelong, and I add life-wide, networked learning. So I look at the shape of our understanding, definition, and use of networks with a view to higher education reform. I'm going to suggest that things defining networked and community-based social pedagogies can provide direction for healthy, effective, and efficient workplaces as well, especially in education. I'm arguing that work and learning networks have significant overlap, and the dichotomous consideration of learning, then work, needs to be dissolved. Note that all networked learning may not refer to specific jobs or even work. I recognize that. But I also know that many networks overlap with learning networks, that learning, in fact, overlaps with many of the social roles that we carry that are networked, and work is really at the top of the list of roles needing continuous learning, learning that can be supported by the combination of work and learning networks. This combination should be under serious consideration as we look at higher education transformation. I'm also going to intersperse this presentation with questions for you that you'll see coming up, and I pose them as reflection questions, and certainly you could email me with your answers. I'd be interested in what you're thinking as we go through this presentation. I want to offer you this advanced organizer for what's some kind of thick, integral, somewhat complex thinking that we're doing to answer this question. What role can learning networks play in combination with other networks to address the higher education transformation necessary for alignment with dynamic digital societies and to support lifelong learning? My first premise is that there's a demand to transform higher education that's very strong. And we need to consider what these demands are and how it is we want to respond. Networked learning, my second premise is that networked learning can offer support to higher education reform by its very definition, and that the overlap between networked learning and work could contribute to this new social contract that we want to create between higher education and society. And then finally, communities of inquiry as pedagogical models can be networked for students and employees in higher education to reposition that relationship between learning and work. So here's my first question for you, and I'm going to pause a moment afterwards so you can think about it. How many networks where you engage in interpersonal relationships for the sake of collaborative engagement are you currently involved? And as you consider the numbers, also consider the role that you play, and most importantly, what does learning play in those networks? I'm going to suggest that learning plays a bigger part in almost everything we do than we sometimes consider. Okay, I'm going to go back to Trow for a minute, who was writing in, this came out in 2006, as he gave us a view to how we might move higher education from elite models into mass models into universal models. And what, oh, I have to go back a slide here, just give me a second. What Trow tried to explain, I think he was brilliant, especially for the time, that we needed to adjust our attitudes to access if we wanted to expand the opportunities for everyone in the world to get into higher education. We needed to look at the functions of higher ed, curriculum and forms of instruction, and the student career. Is it really that we just learn and then we work, or is there another way? Well, I highlighted here what it is he said in under curriculum and forms of instruction. He said boundaries and sequences must break down for universal education. And he was saying all of this before we were clear about the diversity of students that we were going to have engaging in higher ed. He said distinctions between learning and life have to break down. And then finally, this notion that we currently have that you should finish high school and move right into higher education could be postponed. We could consider a different kind of trajectory, something that is more life-wide and lifelong, where you postpone entry and come as it's needed, softening the boundaries between formal education and other aspects of life, particularly work. So Stephen Marshall has written recently, much more recently, a book called Shaping the University of the Future. He looks in particular at Trow's work. And this, along with a couple of other things I'm going to offer you, gives you further points of reference about higher education reform. Trow influenced Marshall in his view to working as hard as possible to create this greater access and universal education. But Marshall also integrates technology, looks at new ways of teaching and learning, and sense-making toward this universal higher education. I recommend what he has to say if you are interested in new ways of reform for higher education. In about the same time that Trow was writing, actually a few years later, 2009, James Duderstadt, who was the president of the University of Michigan in the United States, he created a taxonomy for us, a listing of all the demands on higher education that required us to change. He suggests that these things require us to change what we're doing in higher education. I'm going to read you the list because I think understanding the scope of this gives you a sense of the magnitude of what's in front of us. He identifies all the significant demands for change from changing societies. He says we must consider the impact of the information explosion, rising cost, changing student demographics, global migration, delocalization of education through the technology, increased competition for students, 21st century skill development, employment sector transformation, increasing accountability, and most importantly, the call for quality teaching and relevant learning. So I'm going to add something to Duderstadt's list. And that's that these individual demands have to be treated in reference to one another. For example, if we're going to look at the quality of instruction, we absolutely have to consider changing student demographics, the way technology can enhance or enable that quality, and the information explosion. For example, the rising costs have to be identified in everything that we're trying to do, such that we can do things in the most cost-effective way as possible. So who's pushing the reform agenda right now? Well, I'm privileged to be, oh, hold it, sorry, there's another audience question for you here. I want you to consider that if we're going to add network learning support in higher education institutions, will it, from your perspective, best aid in the demand for improved teaching and learning, industry employment needs, use of technology, globalization support, or a response to learner diversity? I'm going to give you a minute just to think about that. I am privileged to be in the University of the Future Network. Here, this group looks to the creation of models for integrative boundary crossing and collaborative institutions in the wider context. They want to consider fostering truly transdisciplinary teaching, learning, and knowledge creation, the role of information technology, of course, and the workplace as an extension of the classroom through alliances with industry. Integrative, boundary crossing, and collaborative are notions identified in the recent UNESCO report. The International Commission on the Future of Education titled their report, "Imagining Our Futures Together, a New Social Contract for Education." There's an important point that they make in this that I want to highlight here. So much of education now is, to Duderstadt's credit and many others, wanting to adjust for the sake of the society in which we exist. UNESCO's report asks us this: can we shape education so that individuals, as they go through education and move into society, can shape their own individual lives and shape the society in which they exist? So rather than just accepting what is, they move to change what they can't accept and work harder to care for each other and care for our planet. They want us to be rethinking education that will shape the future rather than shaping education to fit what is. I know reference to 14 times to networks also in this report. Here's just a few things that they say, and I quote: different arrangements, incentives, directions, logic, and functionalities are possible for technology and networks that connect us and inform so much of our thinking. And then on page 130, increasing collaborative networks and learning communities among teachers, schools, literary specialists, and policymakers can support the real-time research and application of curricular, programmatic, and policy insights from different quarters. Now, let's move from education reform and what shape it should take and talk about networks. So this is I took this from some work of Peter's and colleagues who wrote about reimagining the new pedagogical possibilities for universities. They're speaking post-COVID-19. I can assure you, higher ed reform was well underway long before the pandemic. Certainly gave us a push and made many people aware of what the possibilities were. What they said is that we need to recognize network learning as critical and emancipatory and a way to understand a commitment to equity, social justice, and sustainability. That's under the assumption that networks are flat, engaging, respectful, and allow everyone to have a voice. We were given the opportunity to read prior to the Network Learning Conference a piece called Network Learning, Inviting Redefinition. I love what they said about network learning as having a great deal to offer teachers and leaders who want a distinctive label for a more ambitious conception of learning, of education moving forward. In this network learning, inviting redefinition, and we are all working on good definitions of networks, of network learning, and in fact of community. And they point the finger at blended learning, which has a significant role to play, I'll say, in network learning. And they're talking about the work that we have to do to identify what blend means. It is certainly pointing us toward future patterns of education provision based on in-person, online, face-to-face, or asynchronously. But they're also accusing blended learning of not being very well defined. So a couple of things. One, I want to highlight the great work that Stefan Rostinsky from Sweden has done on defining different models of blended learning. And I also want to point to a text that I wrote with my student, Dan Wilton, called The Guide to Blended Learning. There's a link here for it, because we try in that work as well to provide healthy definitions of blended learning. Now, networks, network learning, and the community of inquiry have a relationship that I want to identify for you. And I'm going to start by telling you about, get their name right here, that there are researchers, Smith and Company, who identified for us in 2020 that a general theory of social networks can't be complete without considering cognition. Here's what they say, and I quote, "A person's ability to benefit from his or her social network is heavily affected by the person's ability to perceive that network, to encode and recall network ties accurately, and to translate the knowledge they're gaining into the ability to build, maintain, and mobilize those right ties at the right times." So I would de-emphasize their idea of ability a little bit and say what we need is to provide training and models and experiences where that ability can be taught, encouraged, created. And I think that considering the relationship between communities and networks will be one of the ways that we might be able to do that. Peters et al. Also talking about network learning, identify 3 elements that are very important and have to be present in order for it to be a learning network. There has to be interpersonal relationships, the use of technology for convenience and communication, and collaborative engagement. The third point that's identified on this slide is how all of this comes together from my perspective. And that's that the community of inquiry pedagogical model created by Garrison, Anderson, and Archer in 2000 has been well researched, created and offered as a way to shape not only online learning, although it started as a theory for online learning, it's now branched out so that it's clearly a model of bringing students and teachers together in a way that provides the best deep and meaningful learning possible. This community of inquiry model talks about the importance of cognition. It talks about the social side and identifies a role for teaching that's part of the community and not just in the hands of the teacher. It defines presence like this. We want you to be aware that in this model, there's an expectation that there will be a state of alert awareness, receptivity, and connectedness to the social, cognitive, emotional, and physical workings of oneself as an individual and the group. So I see the tie there between what Smith is saying about social networks, and saying that we have to consider cognition if it's going to be a healthy network, and the others who are talking about learning networks and saying relationships have to be interpersonal, there has to be technology support so that it's convenient, and there must be collaborative engagement. All of those things are represented in this community of inquiry model. So I see this convergence occurring in these theorists and what they have to say. Here's another question for you to stop and reflect for a moment. What do you believe could be the most beneficial element of a blended, networked work environment? Increased interaction, collaboration, flexibility, social presence, engagement. Think about that. I'm going to give you just a moment. I'm going to assign you some homework and suggest that you go and have a look at, if you don't know this model already, which you well may, but that you go and have a look at the definitions. I do want to say this. The social presence definition has evolved over time, and Dr. Randy Garrison, my mentor, my colleague, and my friend, has identified very clearly the importance of developing interpersonal relationships if a community of inquiry is going to emerge and be a healthy engagement. The other thing that's very clearly identified in this model is that teaching presence is meant to be exactly that, not teacher presence. That doesn't mean we discount the importance of the expert, the instructor of record, that person who has to mark the assignments when this is offered in courses. But the theorists have been very clear about the fact that to create a community of learning, that teaching presence has to be offered as a possibility to others in the community as well. We know that to teach is to learn effectively, and we also know that peer teaching can be a very effective model. It's defined as the design, facilitation, and direction of cognitive and social processes. Teaching presence is offered to anyone within the community. And that's an important point I want to highlight at this point, because it's going to come up again in just a moment. These three presences do break down into sub-elements. Again, I suggest that you have a look at the writings about this so you understand what these subcategories mean. I've already said what teaching presence requires, the design, facilitation, and direction. I'll highlight again that social presence requires open communication, group cohesion, and interpersonal expression. That comes through the design of the community of inquiry. And then just quickly, cognitive presence has some activity elements in it. Makes it look here like they're linear when in fact they're not. There's a lot of looping around and back and forth. You need a catalyst or a triggering event. You need time and encouragement to explore what that problem, what that issue, what that new content really means. You need to integrate what's happening into other things that you already know about. And then finally, you need to come to some manner of resolution. This is as far as we can go right now. This is as much as we know. This is what we're sure will solve that problem. I want to suggest that we can take this and if we added work activity completion with inquiry-based learning activities, what would we get? Well, not all work is collaborative. A lot of it can be. Addressing the needs and challenges of higher education transformation has a complexity that requires a range of expertise. People with that expertise working in collaboration. We have to learn from each other in order to realize solutions to address multiple and complex issues. So I adjusted some of the wording here to make it look like something that would fit a work environment as much as a learning environment. I changed teaching presence to leading presence. Just as teaching presence allows and encourages community participants to consider that shaping the experience for all, shared and distributed leadership models allow community members to lead when appropriate or necessary. Flatter power structures, shared accountability, and higher levels of engagement can be realized through these shared leadership models. And you would be leading to support and enhance social presence and cognitive or thinking presence, all working toward the highest level of productivity possible. The sub-elements for the community of inquiry that's based on work, inquiry, and productivity could be the same. We need to explore that further. I've adjusted some of the language, but I think there is opportunity to have these three elements support us in creating highly productive, engaging, inquiry-based work communities. Here's a question for you. Which of the three community of inquiry elements or presences would be, from your perspective, the most difficult to adapt to the workplace? for networked communities of inquiry. Social presence, cognitive presence, leading presence, or all three. We just need a different model, or you're unsure. I'll give you a minute to think about that. One of my research groups and I have looked through the literature and from some of the data we've collected in massive open online courses we've done with thousands of educators across the globe. And I hope you will take the time to pause the recording and read all of this, but I want this is going to start our research about what a multimodal work network has to have on the social side in order to be effective and satisfying. And these are all of the things that we identified. I'm going to highlight the idea of using online spaces and structured activities that encourage and support social interaction, that you make explicit the need for social presence and the value that it adds to work productivity, and that you discuss the work climate as it evolves, rather than waiting for conflict to erupt or things to break down, that you have regular, if not frequent, discussions about how the work community is supporting individuals and what kinds of things need to be tweaked, adjusted to make them better. So we talked earlier about how those writing so eloquently about learning networks are also talking about blending. And I want to say, if we're going to blend networks at work, we need to have balance of that in-person or virtual synchronous, face-to-face or asynchronous engagement, depending on the opportunities, needs, and personal preferences. All the normal requirements of professionalism, good communication, respect, healthy group dynamics apply. You need spaces for shared documentation. That in itself, in the digital world, takes some training. And then finally, there's going to be new technology. There's going to be new roles for people to play. And there's going to have to be some agreed upon rules about how things are going to operate in this blended networking at work that includes learning. We still have some work to do to identify the definitions between networks versus communities. Originally, Wenger and his colleagues some time ago now identified networks as a set of relationships, personal interactions, and connections. And then community, they identified, which I do agree with, as the development of a shared identity around a topic or set of challenges, collective intention, and that the communities are meant to steward a domain of knowledge and sustain learning about it. I'd like to think that some of those things they said about communities also play a role in network learning as well. We have some stuff still to do on this, and more recently, this notion of what's a network, what's a community is being blurred in the literature. Asher, for example, talks about professional skill development through networked learning communities. That's an interesting combination of both. I think that will help us, but that there still needs to be definition. And then finally, Jan and their group are actually looking at very detailed social network analysis and learning communities. So how is that learning community related to that social network? And is that social network a learning network? So I encourage you to consider these things and send me an email if you want to discuss it. I like the visual that's created here, and that we've got working communities that are more intense, perhaps more intimate. People know each other better. They see each other more frequently. They're more connected through expertise and activity, but they are networked with other communities that are working perhaps to similar ends, but in with a different approach, or in an area that's also related. Okay, very quickly, we did some research about the benefits of blended learning and work environments, and it was really clear that our respondents felt the benefits were increased interaction, increased collaboration, more accessibility, flexibility, higher levels of social presence, and a much more person and student engagement. So I'm suggesting, to wrap it up, that we can use the community of inquiry for adjusting how it is we do our work together, such that that work continuously involves learning, and that we make learning a premium and celebrate it, support it, etc., as we get our work done and we increase our productivity, such that work communities of inquiry can develop as nodes. So the community, rather than the individual, become the nodes, in order that we can go through all the transformation and more that Duderstadt identified, and construct environments where those who are involved with us understand how important learning is as a lifelong activity, because we're modeling it in higher education. We also don't want to forget UNESCO's challenge to us to say, let's create learning networks that encourage people to not only fit well into society, but shape that society so that we have healthy society, and in fact, a healthy planet, as we learn to shape what's going on around us to make it better at every junction. Thank you so much. I have one more question for you. What best role can learning networks play in combination with other networks to address the higher education transformation necessary with dynamic digital societies, and to support life-wide learning? And I have 5 things that you can read here. Maybe you think it's all of the above, but if you think there's some priorities, identify that and decide where you're going to put your efforts to make higher education a better place as you work with, collaborate with, and learn from others. I will now end the recording. If you have any questions, feel free to email me. I'm Marty C at athabascau.ca. I'm sure you can find me if you Google it. And I thank you very much for your attention. I wish you well in your future endeavors. Bye-bye.